It's not often that a volunteer gets to stand in front of so many who work at end of life and the professionals, the ones that do it. So I'm going to take my opportunity and take my chance and say thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you do. I lost my mum to cancer. My dad had a beautiful death in hospital. He was really cared, and I lost a best friend. And so that's personally. But then I get to be a volunteer and I see what you all do, day in, day out. Thank you. It's one of the side things of being a volunteer I never thought is we get to be an ambassador. We get to see the inside of the NHS and then be able to go out and say, wow, you guys are amazing. I see all the nurses who don't take breaks and just keep going and keep going. I can remember one nurse saying to me one day, she said, somebody, I have to, reduce their fluids now, but they're actually probably getting more fluid than me right now. I've been on shift 12 hours and I haven't really stopped. So I know how hard you work, so thanks. It's one of the reasons that it's so great to be part of Team NHS. So, as I said, my journey towards volunteering was initiated from quite a quick succession of the death of my dad, then my mum, and then one of my best friends. And afterwards it got me thinking, they had family, they had support, they had visitors. What if you don't? What if you're on your own? What if your family live far away? What if you've got no one? So in 2011 I began volunteering in Macmillan Caring locally, which is part of the Bournemouth and Christchurch Hospital Trust. And it was in a palliative care unit. It was the first palliative care unit ever in the country. And I volunteered in the day centre on what we called Motor Neuron Wednesday. So most of the motor neuron patients used to come in on that day. And I started off doing teas and coffees and then sitting with patients. And my role involved a lot of listening. But when those patients started to move on to the ward, that's when I began to think, well, hey, could I maybe do a different role? Could I be going onto the ward in the evening and sitting with people as they die? So I eventually plucked up courage and asked, could I do that role? And there was like, no, volunteers don't do that. And I pushed, but there was one nurse who really, really supported me. And eventually the trust said, okay, we'll give you a trial. That was 2012. So from 1 6-month trial, we now have a team of 15 of us, and we've got every night covered. No one, hopefully, is dying alone. We're also on call. So how would I describe the role? Well, every shift is different. I might be making teas, cleaning people's tabletops. I spent a lot of time looking for TV remotes. I might be listening to incredible life stories, worries, regrets, supporting families. Or I might be sitting with somebody and holding their hand as they pass out of life. Sorry, this is where I turn the page. I have to have notes because otherwise I go off-piste. From my initial tentative steps and experience in training and mentoring other volunteers, I learned some valuable insights into end-of-life volunteering, which I'd like to share with you. And the first one involves a huge embarrassment alert on my part. You see, when I started volunteering, I'm so ashamed by this, but I thought I was going to help people. No, that wasn't what was going to happen. I was going to learn how to be of service, how to be of support to people at end of life. And the patients I sat with were going to teach me humility and redefine my idea of being helpful. And it turns out the role is really unique. It's learning not to do, but to be alongside. And we also have learnt some valuable things as a team. So one of the first big things we learnt is there is no point trying to be some generic model of the ideal volunteer. Turns out people at end of life have a highly trained radar for anybody who's not being authentic. Yeah. So we found that patients would often choose specific volunteers for specific reasons. So they might be having chit chat with me, they might want to pour out their heart to Lucy, or they might want to die with Terry holding their hand, or vice versa. It taught us not to be overly attached to a particular patient, and also not to assume that we were the right volunteer for a particular patient or a particular situation. We've learned that patients will choose us for what they need according to our personality, so it's important that we remain that personality. We also have to acknowledge that we're going to make mistakes. And part of the training has to be really honest that everyone makes mistakes. New volunteers can get really worried about saying or doing the wrong thing, especially if the volunteer's like me and doesn't come from a healthcare background. I used to edit law books, so you know. Volunteers have to be reminded that the patients are not looking for perfection. They're looking for connection. That said, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in the car hitting my head against the steering wheel and thinking, I cannot believe I just said that to a patient. Sure, we've all been there. But the team, if it works, a volunteer team, if we can share our mistakes, if we can be honest, if we can be encouraged to do that, then everybody grows and learns from each other. And that's what makes us stronger. We have to be vulnerable. We've learnt to be humble, obviously no place for ego, and I have found that if I ever did get a bit above myself, patients are very good at putting me back in my place. Also, I wanted to share this because I feel it's quite important. We also have to be very mindful as end-of-life volunteers about the attention we get, particularly from the media, because of what we do. And while it's understandable that we get that attention, it's very important that the role does not set us above other volunteers within the NHS. We don't want to become part of some volunteer hierarchy. Volunteering in any form is a privilege, and I'm sure you'll agree that every volunteer, regardless of role, is equally valuable to the NHS. And I think the moments I've been most humbled have been like a guy planting flowers outside where the ambulance drives up, so he knows that the patients will feel safe the moment they arrive. A guy who, very elderly, but he says, I'm retired, I have a time, I can sleep whenever. So if somebody dies on the ward and their loved one has to get a taxi home, he drives them. He goes in with them, he makes them a cup of tea. He makes sure that person isn't on their own, that they're okay before he leaves them, rather than being just dropped back to home by a taxi. I mean, lovely, isn't it? You could say, well, that he's a volunteer driver. No, he's so much more than a volunteer driver. End-of-life volunteering involves something very significant. It involves greeting somebody where they are and not where we want them to be. So can I accept that today someone I've sat with many times doesn't want me to sit with them anymore? Can I accept a family member is so distraught that I'm the person who's going to receive the brunt of that frustration? Greeting somebody where they are has allowed me to let go of judgment and to just say present. And finally, there is self-care. And I guess this all begins with boundaries. Knowing what my role is and knowing what my role isn't. And if in doubt, to always refer to a member of staff. To be mindful of how to approach the patients and honour their personal bed space. To ask permission to sit down next to them. To never assume anything. And particularly be mindful of holding a hand or any form of touch. And if I know my boundaries, then that keeps the patient safe, but it also keeps me safe too. I always say to volunteers, on every shift we represent every other end-of-life volunteer in every hospital throughout the NHS, because this role is really precious and needed, so we have to hold those boundaries in high regard. Self-care also involves us supporting our fellow volunteers to offer reflective practice, to go to team meetings, ongoing mentorship. And we also need thanks. We don't do it for thanks, but it's so lovely when we get it, to feel part of the NHS team. I can still remember the evening when I got invited into the nurses' staff room and we all scoffed a box of chocolates that had just been donated. And I can remember thinking, wow, I've landed now. I'm actually considered part of the team. I'm sharing the chocolates, I'm in. But I know that occasionally staff find the volunteer role challenging, who we are. Who are we without nursing experience to sit with somebody who's dying? And I get that. I think the importance is to remember the distinction for us is we are volunteers not doing, we are volunteers being. And as long as we stay in that being role, hopefully there's less room for error. See, as end-of-life volunteers, we have the privilege of doing the very thing that most palliative care nurses join nursing for. We get to sit at the bedside and be with those patients. I can remember one nurse being so relieved when I came on shift and shedding a tear later because it was me that sat with her patient when that patient died. And I think it's important that volunteers stay very humble to that and remember that it's the vast experience of nurses that are there backing us up, enabling us to be able to support and do this role. So that's a snapshot of my role. I wanted to finish with a quote. I met the first week on my ward this lady. She was really, really tiny. You know how some people shrink at end of life, as she was tiny lady in a bed, beautiful, 96 years old. She had no one because her daughter had predeceased her. Bright as a button, total inspiration. And at the end of her visit with us, because she went to a nursing home, the last day I saw her, she said, "Can you make me a promise? Can you promise me that you or someone else will never stop doing this? Because it's so needed. You've made a difference to my time here. Promise me that there will always be volunteers willing to sit with people facing the end of their lives." So thank you to everyone here, because you're making her dream come true. Bless you.
Mandy, are there ever days that you feel you just can't?
Yeah, and I had a little bit of a burnout actually a couple of years ago, and I didn't realise that I had 4 deaths of people that I'd known from the day centre. So they all died within a month of each other, and I'd known them for 4 years. So boom, 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 boom. But the last one was she brought up a lot of memories about my mum, and I didn't realise, but I think that coincided. I hate to mention the menopause word, but I somehow the emotional filter was being harder to hold on to. Or, you know when you shed a tear at the bedside, but you full blubbing you don't do. But I was finding that was getting harder, so I had to have a break. And I think it was just that. It was just 4 deaths, but probably that lady's who just triggered me. So I think we do talk as volunteers about triggers a lot, that they've got to be very aware that, it'll be, all of us will have different triggers, and being honest, I think, when you're recruited about who you might not want to be able to sit, like one of our volunteers says she just can't sit with any young men because it's too close to her, because she's got a son who did have cancer. He's now well, but it's too close. Yeah.
How supportive are clinicians with your role?
Really, really great now. Yeah.
I've been the word, I think.
I can remember my first night on the ward, a really lovely staff nurse who attended at the end was actually my main supporter. But the first night she said, "What are you going to do?" I was like, "I don't know." And I said, "Oh, I'll go and listen." And she said, "Very good, you go do that." I was like, oh God. I think the people that find it challenging are the ones that are worried that we haven't got the experience, or we might say or do the wrong thing or get carried away. I think boundaries is a real issue. But the big turning point, I think, was when we were invited to staff meetings and started having conversations about what they felt our role should be. So the more we integrated, the better it became. And now it just works really well. And we do feel we're completely part of the team. And I think that's really, really nice. And our volunteer coordinator always goes to staff once a week, goes and meets all the clinicians and goes to those meetings. So she's kind of, not that she's feeding back to the volunteers, but so that if there's any problem with the volunteers, she hears firsthand, if there's something coming up.
Do you find senior management like chairs or lead nurses really notice the impact you make? Yes, they do actually. And I think what happened from that was us really piloting it and really looking at, I didn't realise, I was a bit naive. I was just going in and doing my shift, but of course they were following me around with asking patients and family. I had no idea, which is probably good, really. But yes, we spent a lot of time then assessing and getting as many details as we can about how people find the role. So I think then clinicians have really become proud of being able to say what we do. And that's the thing, isn't it? Is if you see it as something that you're offering an extra level of service, then everybody starts being able to see you as part of a team. Then it becomes a team benefit. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mandy.
You're welcome. Thank you.